With the evolution of the parachute and airborne soldiers, traditional ground warfare acquired a new third dimension. Now armies could not only be outflanked, they could be enveloped from the air within seconds by paratroopers. But once sky soldiers hit the dirt, they're more or less infantrymen fighting with the small weapons they carry. Helicopters brought the promise of high-speed deployment of soldiers, heavy artillery, and supporting munitions where and whenever the enemy least expected them. But just as the concept of air mobile operations was being tested, so was American resolve in the jungles of Vietnam. To the men of the 1st Cavalry Division fell the unenviable task of airborne trial by fire.
Golf 3, receiving fire from the left, receiving fire from the left. Golf 3 reporting fire from the left. Dark fire on area to left of Golf 3, stand by the success.
Flying in a helicopter on combat assault is a rush of adrenaline that just simply can't be duplicated, I think, anywhere. There was something about it, and I still, to this day, I hear the pop, pop, pop of a Huey helicopter. I just get a feeling inside.
There's something about those helicopter blades and hearing artillery firing and seeing jets flying by and wagging their wings and all that. You know, they're all doing that for me, my little radio frequency. You know.
I think the Air Cav was the sexiest unit in Vietnam. It was a unit that it saw an incredible amount of action. Our riding into battle was a romantic way to do it. We carried the same elan that horse cavalry did.
They, as far as I know, won more presidential unit citations and more medals of honor and all of those trinkets that go along with this sort of thing than any other division in the Vietnam War. There was a sense of power about it, a sense of majesty, if you will, and they could appear so quickly. If you were on the ground watching this happen, suddenly there's nothing, and the next minute there's 300 men on the ground. Bang! In your face. If they came in shooting, it must have looked like hell on earth for the other side.
The 1st Air Cavalry Division was the most lethal assault force assembled in Vietnam. Their pilots were the first to fully harness the power of helicopters, and their soldiers' combat record was second to none. But as late as 1962, the notion of helicopter warfare was considered a radical concept to the U.S. Army. It took continued prodding by then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara for the Army to study the feasibility of air mobile forces. After months of analysis, they proposed a testing program to be headed by Brigadier General Harry Kennard. Kennard was no stranger to airborne operations. As a seasoned parachutist in the 101st Airborne Division, he knew his men were unafraid of heights and somewhat accustomed to the tactics of vertical envelopment. From these ranks came most of the helicopter test personnel. In the woods of Fort Benning, Georgia, they began tinkering with the new methods of air assault. Soon the versatile helicopter was being compared to the horse as a means of resurrecting the Army's cavalry. In 1943, the Army eliminated its last horse-mounted units, and since then the traditional U.S. cavalry had all but disappeared. But the promise of helicopters meant the infantry could once again have long-range scouts at its disposal.
When the cavalry met men on horses, they had a mobility differential over a man on foot. They could move faster and farther. But then in the era of the motor vehicle, cavalry did not have a mobility differential over the other people in the other arms. And so we really didn't have a true cavalry in the sense of somebody who could move faster and farther. But when we got the helicopter, we could do that again.
But the notion of transporting soldiers directly into combat inside seemingly vulnerable helicopters called for a complete reevaluation of aerial weapons and tactics. The test participants were encouraged to come up with new ideas to help fashion the Air Mobile Force.
It was not just different in degree, it was different in kind. It was brand new. I mean, we were the first unit in the whole world that was trying to use aircraft as their principal method of doing everything. So that called for all kinds of developmental work, and it also called for a state of mind, because instead of thinking in terms of miles, you began to think in terms of minutes. And instead of thinking of roads and bridges and railroads and rivers and so forth, you began to think of flight routes and altitude and escort. So it really was an air mobile state of mind, and it took a lot of doing to develop.
Air Mobile meant lighter was better. The Sky Soldiers learned to move only with the weapons they could carry. For all other arms, the slogan was, if you can't lift it with a helicopter, you are better off without it.
The artillery gave up their trucks and used the heavy lift helicopters to move their artillery pieces into position, and then became the bearers of ammunition that supported those artillery pieces where they were. So the centrally controlled heavy lift helicopters became not only the prime movers of the artillery, but also the means of their resupply of ammunition.
We started putting artillery right on the tops of mountains. They could fire in every direction. No other artillery in the world can get up there, let alone bring ammunition to them. So it just opens up all kinds of new vistas. And one thing that I liked about our testing was that we were free to just try all these things. Every day we learned something new about the helicopter.
To protect the assault force, rocket launchers were attached to Huey helicopters and tested in a close air support role.
Rockets were the weapon of choice. They were the weapon that gave us the best coverage for our missions. We would note where the rounds were hitting when fired by the pilot using the regular sight, and then take a grease pencil and put an X on the windshield. And we referred to that as a battle sight.
The gunships were used as aerial firepower, which essentially is artillery. And the Aerial Rocket Artillery Battalion was used in the traditional Army role.
These new helicopter missions called for pilots who were as brave as they were skilled. Each had to prove his mettle in an aerial obstacle course, complete with dirt trails, low-slung wires, and water hazards. Air Mobile pilots were expected to fly wherever the objective was.
We invented a Chinook ladder, and with it, we'd have the Air Force blow a hole in the jungle, and then we'd hover above the hole, lower the Chinook ladder. You could have men going up or down. And what that meant was that there's no terrain in the world that we can't get to with the helicopter. It just doesn't exist. We can go anywhere.
In 1964, the air assault concept was finally put to the test in the woods of North Carolina. 35,000 soldiers participated in war games that pitted the Air Mobile team against both guerrilla and conventional aggressor forces.
As the aggressor forces, we felt superior to the air cav because we had machine guns, and we figured that shooting down helicopters with 50 caliber machine guns would be like shooting sitting ducks. And we also felt that we were pretty invulnerable to the light machine guns that the helicopters were carrying. Of course, at that time, I didn't know anything about aerial rocket artillery, or I might have been a little more concerned about it. My particular track was knocked out twice, so maybe there was something to that.
The Air Mobile forces demonstrated they could control the enemy over a wide territory, and General Kennard issued his findings to the Army.
I'd like to emphasize that the final word is not yet in. We are almost certain to uncover new problems which must be solved. We are even more certain, I believe, of discovering new and unthought-of capabilities.
Most of all, however, the important thing about air mobility was it allowed you to focus on the enemy. You no longer had to fight the terrain, and you could go right at the enemy. In my mind, that was the most important single aspect of air mobility.
In the Pentagon, the air assault tests were followed almost as closely as the buildup of communist guerrilla forces in Vietnam, and a bold decision was made. The test division was promptly redesignated the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. On July 28, 1965, the day it achieved combat-ready status, President Johnson addressed the nation.
We intend to convince the communists that we cannot be defeated by force of arms. I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division.
With those few words, the ongoing American helicopter support missions in Vietnam would soon change.
Essentially, the hopes of the Army were riding on this division as a different way to fight this war. The one thing everybody was reasonably sure of is that truck-mounted troops didn't work for the French, and they weren't going to work for us, and we had to find a new way to fight the enemy. And everybody had settled on the helicopter as being the way, but it had not been tested, not in combat, nor had the techniques been perfected.
Ready or not, the 1st Cavalry Division was headed for the jungles of Vietnam.
Our Century estará de volta em instantes no canal de História. Our Century está de volta no canal de História.
The 1st Cavalry Division set up camp near the town of An Khe in the central highlands of Vietnam. The base camp was protected by a cleared strip of land 100 meters wide, with artillery and riflemen stationed along the perimeter. Sentries also stood watch on a lookout mountain nearby. On this spot, 435 helicopters and 15,000 men stood between the North Vietnamese Army and their prime objective, the upper half of South Vietnam. The NVA strategy was to move their forces from the Pleiku province to the east coast and split the country in half. Controlling the rest of the country, they reasoned, would just be a matter of time. What they didn't know was the Air Cavalry Division was already looking for them. Under the cover of triple canopy jungle, 2 North Vietnamese Army regiments began massing for their invasion in the fall of 1965. But the Air Cavalry scout helicopters spotted them in the Ia Drang Valley and didn't let go. Wherever the NVA retreated, they found the Air Cav in the way. After a month of continuous fighting, the cavalry's 1st Battalion of the 7th Cav airlifted to a small landing zone codenamed LZ X-Ray near the Chupong Massif. The next few days would be a turning point in the Vietnam War.
It happened that clearing at the base of the Chupong Massif was the base area for one of the battalions. 2 other battalions of the North Vietnamese were within a mile. And when Colonel Moore's people hit the ground, Lieutenant Colonel Win Hu An, the ground commander sitting up on the slopes of Chupong Mountain, said, attack, attack, attack. He told his commanders, go surround them, don't let them get away, don't let them escape by helicopter, kill them all. And that was clearly the intention of his forces.
When the North Vietnamese opened fire, they outnumbered the Americans 10-1.
Colonel Moore had to close the LZ because it was so hot. There were enemy in the LZ. And they were shooting at the helicopters from 20, 30 meters away, right into the nose of the chopper, right into the face of the pilots.
I air assaulted in about 4:30 on the afternoon of the first day. You can hear the rounds when they hit the fuselage of the helicopter. It makes a noise. And you can see the tracers coming right at us. The LZ was really hot, and there was a lot of smoke and a lot of tracers, and it was an incredibly noisy surrealistic sort of an event. It doesn't really get terrifying until you start seeing people get hit.
On their side, they were developing their own principles of how to fight the Americans and how to fight the helicopters. And the main thing that they were doing was defining a principle they called hugging the belt. Get them by the belt buckle. Get in so close that all of their firepower, their artillery, their air support, all this American high-tech stuff won't work because I'll be in the foxhole with the American. There was fighting with bayonets at LZX. Men stuck other men in the chest with bayonets on the end of rifles and kicked them off and kept going. This was the sort of intensity of the thing. Terrible things were going on. Men were dying.
Lieutenant Joe Marm was on scene for just 2 hours when he was given a mission to rescue another platoon pinned down several hundred meters away.
We're moving forward. We had 2 companies, and we were trying to get up to that platoon that was trapped on the side of the mountain.
As Lieutenant Marm and his men began moving toward the platoon, they came upon a large anthill.
For my platoon, it was this machine gun bunker or anthill. We didn't know what it was, but there's, we're taking a lot of fire from that particular area. They were using it probably for concealment and camouflage, but I shot a law into it, a light anti-tank weapon. That did some damage. So I told my troops to hold their fire while I went forward. So I got to the anthill and got a grenade and threw it over the top. 5-second delayed fuse, very quick. Doesn't take long for it to go off. It made a big explosion. I don't know what happened because after this I went around to the side and there was still some NVA around. I shot some of them with my weapon, my M16. And everything was pretty quiet then. And then I wanted to get my men up forward so we could get to the platoon. And so and that's right when I turned sideways and I was shot myself. Bullet entered my left jaw, not my right cheek. So my fight was actually over fairly early, after probably 4 hours of the first day of the battle. I'm sorry to say I wasn't able to stay there with my men and see them through the fight.
With reinforcements being flown in, the 1st Battalion held off the besieging forces. But the next day, the attackers returned in larger numbers, forcing Battalion Commander Colonel Hal Moore to send out the priority distress call, Broken Arrow. Every available aircraft in the area came to the aid of the CAV.
The air support was fantastic. They were stacked at 1,000-foot intervals from 7,000 feet to 30,000 feet. Everything, Air Force, Navy, Marines, once again, air mobile. The aerial rocket artillery ships were all over that place.
We were the first on station to provide fire. The only thing I could think of was the guys on the ground, whether or not we could keep Charlie off their back, because it was obvious from where we were firing and from where we could see that they were being pressed pretty hard.
We had a solid ring of artillery fire around us. We had everything the United States government could possibly provide us. But it's true of any war. You don't win it until you have a man on the ground with a rifle.
The American firepower was too much. As the North Vietnamese escaped towards Cambodia, they left nearly 2,000 dead soldiers behind.
So you ended up with what the administration in Washington had been looking for, which was a victory, and a pretty spectacular one at that. And they needed this, and they greeted it warmly, and what they didn't know was that the battle wasn't over.
Without helicopters or artillery support, The 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cav opted to walk towards landing zone Albany, a clearing 3 miles away. On their way, they walked into a fresh NVA battalion. Under siege, the men called back for help.
It was the hottest LZ I ever assaulted, more so to me than X-ray. At that time, the survivors of the battalion were holed up in a little copse of trees that couldn't have been any more than 30 yards long and 15 yards wide. And that's all they owned in the battlefield. The LZ was so hot that the pilot made a couple passes before he got close enough to us to get off. And at that point, he didn't land. I jumped out of the chopper about 12 feet off the ground and immediately rolled into a dead North Vietnamese body. And bullets were snapping overhead. I said to myself, this is a bad, bad place.
There was unimaginable butchery over the next 12 to 14 hours. The 2nd Battalion of 7th Cavalry lost 155 men killed right then and there, one day. I think probably the most savage single day's battle of the Vietnam War.
When we got over the target area, we could see that we could keep the hostiles off. They walked right into the middle of it. It was close. It was real close. We were drawing fire on all of our passes. Of course, not nearly as much as the first suckers on the ground.
They were very relieved that we were there. We dug in the positions and we spent the night there, keeping one another alive.
There were horrors that occurred there in that night. The enemy walking through that grass, killing the wounded, capturing and killing people frightened out of their minds. There are nightmares born of that battle that haven't gone away.
In 5 days of fighting, the 1st Air Cavalry lost 234 men.
Some very brave men gave their lives on that field, and it would be romantic and patriotic to say that they gave their lives for their country, but they really gave their lives for their friends. And that's what men in combat fight for. They fight for one another.
Our Century estará de volta em instantes no canal de História. Na próxima... Our Century está de volta no canal de História.
The 1st Cavalry Division's victory in the Ia Drang Valley signaled the beginning of a more assertive U.S. role in South Vietnam's defense. But when the North Vietnamese retreated, General Kennard learned just how far he could go in this war.
At the end of that campaign, as they went across the border into Cambodia, I asked for permission to follow them into Cambodia because I wanted to really put them out of the war. I got approval in Vietnam to do that from both Westmoreland and from Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the ambassador at that time. He went back to the States and it was disapproved. We were not allowed to cross into Cambodia. As long as he had a sanctuary that was inviolate and we couldn't follow him into it, there was no way that we could win that war. And so the net result was about 5 months later, these guys had brought a lot of new men down the trail, retrained, and here they came again.
In the first major U.S. engagement of the war, the Air Cavalry not only saved the South from being cut in half, it proved helicopters could dictate the pace of battle across a vast territory that had few roads or trails.
It was also a triumph because we're able to evacuate wounded, bring in supplies by air. It also indicated that the helicopter was very survivable because there were only 2 were wounded and later were air vac out and restored to flying status.
For their valor in the Ia Drang Valley, the 1st Cavalry Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. It was only the 5th time in American history that an Army division was so honored. A year after being shot, Lieutenant Joe Marm recovered and received the nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor.
But for an inch or a couple of centimeters one way or the other, and I could be dead. It could have severed a jugular vein or hit me in the temple, or just a matter of, I'm just very, very fortunate that, it just wasn't my day to do it. Some of our troops made it through the whole battle without a scratch. It's kind of the fate of war. You just have to continue to do your job until it's your turn to go. I feel that I'm the caretaker of the medal for these brave men that served with me in any rank. Any one of, there's many valorous deeds that went on there. It's their award, and I'm just the holder of it for them.
The tenacity of the Air Mobile Division was due in large part to its reconnaissance squadron, the 1st of the 9th Cavalry.
The 1st Air Cav had a tremendous intelligence gathering capability with its Air Cavalry Squadron. Our Air Cavalry Squadron developed something in the neighborhood of 40% of the fights the division had.
They did it wonderfully well. They were pure air mobility. They were the eyes and the ears of the 1st Cavalry Division. They were out there dropping these little blue teams here and there. And as General Fung said, you drove us crazy. You leapfrogged behind us, in front of us, to the sides. You stole our supplies. You took our hospital. You drove us nuts. That was the 1st of the 9th, doing the cavalry thing. But doing it like Geronimo or doing it like Cochise.
Locating guerrilla forces in jungle terrain called for low-altitude flights to lure the enemy into shooting first. This recon by decoy mission went to the white team in scout helicopters. Backing them up were the red team gunships.
These guys were crazy. They were flying H-19s, H-13s. And I can remember we were out in the boondocks one time, and they had these 2 helicopters, just a treetop level, above us, trying to draw enemy fire. And all of a sudden, all these tracers open up on these guys, and you could see the door gunner trying to shoot back at them. And I said to the sergeant, get his tail number. And I tried to put in an entire crew for a silver star. The guy cussed me out. When I went over to that compound, he said, oh, you damn silver star, buy me a beer. I said, their call sign was Thirsty Six. We're thirsty. And we like kick ass and take names. Morale was just sky high.
They were the essence of cavalry. The only difference being is they moved from horses into helicopters, so that their reach was not a day's ride on a horse. Their reach was how far the Huey helicopter would take you. And they moved into that with great elan, great esprit. They grew the mustaches, they wore the Stetson hats, they carried their papers in saddlebags, and they lived the dream of the cavalry.
The Blues were the 3rd strike team in the recon squadron. Their job was to close with the enemy until the main cavalry force arrived. Although they had just 4% of the Air Mobile Division's infantry and only 17% of its helicopters, the reconnaissance squadron accounted for nearly half of the Cav's enemy killed.
Our Century estará de volta em instantes no canal de História. Armas de guerra. Our Century está de volta no canal de História.
One of the basic tenets of the Viet Cong guerrilla tactics was to attack only when they were able to concentrate superior numbers, and even then they were often first to break off the engagement. To that end, they were initially successful. But the helicopter began to reverse that advantage. As more troops were airlifted into battle, fewer avenues were left for the enemy's escape. It was air mobile operations that forced the Viet Cong to stand and fight. As the 1st Cavalry Division moved out of the mountainous highlands and into the valley terrain, The enemy there were Viet Cong guerrillas who had taken over the towns and villages.
He took all of the rice plantings. He held the towns. The people were subjugated. And I felt that if we went in there and ran him out and gave people a chance to grow their rice and have their own government, that the ARVN, the South Vietnamese, could come in and take it over and leave us free to go somewhere else. We had constant contact with the enemy every day for over a month with an entirely different kind of enemy, entirely different kind of terrain. Proved that air mobility worked.
The air mobile tactic soon spread to other Army units, but none of them had as many helicopters for an air assault as the 1st Air Cav.
The combat assault was the CAV's thing. And the combat assault is what made the CAV different than other organizations. It's what, I think, bonded the soldiers, the grunt, and the aviators together, was that incredible feeling, incredible adrenaline rush as you flew through the air and then flew into an objective area.
In the air, the pilots took charge. Often just 19 years old, these young men were responsible for getting their troops in on time.
They were superbly trained. They were very, 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 very brave. Foolishly brave, I think, sometimes. But we knew we could depend on it. This is not a slam on the Air Force. Not meant that way. But our pilots were grunts who learned to fly. And their friends were grunts, and the guys they drank with were grunts. And they weren't going to let any grunts get killed if they could help it.
When you have to trust your life to those people and they have to trust you with their life, friendships become hard and fast. We realized when we took new guys out, and you could tell the new guys, they had the brand new helmet liners and the brand new camouflage helmets. I mean, and it's say July 1969 or 68, and it was July 68, so you know that they were brand new, and we knew where we were taking them, and you know, that was not nice. So we treated them as well as we could.
We would try to mystify the enemy as best we could onto what landing zones we were going to use. So oftentimes we would prep 2 or 3 different landing zones. By prepping a landing zone, we would call in aerial rocket artillery or fixed tube artillery or Navy or Navy guns if we were close to the shore, or perhaps or Air Force. And they would hit the LZ with high explosives, and the helicopters would follow in within 3 or 4 minutes after the fire had lifted.
During the combat assaults, you've got 3 radios going. You've got an FM, you've got a UHF, you've got a VHF radio that you're talking on. So you have your hands full. You're flying the aircraft. You've got to make sure that the troops get out. You've got to make sure you get off. And there's 30 or 40 other helicopters all flying around you. It's a fantastic sight. And that's when the adrenaline gets running.
Despite the artillery preparation, there was no assurance the enemy wasn't still there.
You go into an LZ that you think is cold, you know, you go into, well, we're going to get away with this one. And then about the time everybody sets down, then all hell breaks loose.
We knew they were down there. We knew they were down there. But we could never pinpoint their exact location because they would hold their fire. They would hold their fire until we would be in our most vulnerable position, going in or out of a landing zone.
Well, the UE provided absolutely zero protection from gunfire. The skin is very thin. Plexiglass breaks out real easy. It doesn't stop bullets, so you'd wear a ceramic armor vest. I put a lot of times would put my flak vest in the chin bubble to stop bullets. I would bring my pistol belt around to where it sat in my crotch, and I would pull the sides of my armor seat forward as far as they would go so that I was protected as much as possible.
We were inserting some South Korean soldiers onto a mountaintop. And as we came up on the fire base, I could hear this ticking noise, this very loud ticking noise over the intercom. And what it was bullets striking the aircraft. When a bullet hits the helicopter, it will tend to keep right on going out the other side. You can't hear the guns going off that are shooting at you, and it's like you want to suck yourself into your flight helmet. The first reaction is to make yourself small, because there is nowhere to run, there is nowhere to hide. You're hanging 500 feet or more in the air, and bullets are passing through the helicopter. The pilots could hear the ticking noise, and they knew what it was. And the pilot comes on and he says, "Gunners, have you got a target? Have you got a target?" And like most of the time, you would be under fire, but you couldn't see where the fire was coming from. And we basically just started spraying the place. And the idea was that even if you couldn't hit anything out there, if you could make the enemy duck so that you could do your job and then get the hell out of there, then you did what you were supposed to do as a door gunner.
In 1968, the North Vietnamese moved anti-aircraft artillery in the A Shaw Valley. These deadly guns were radar-directed and fired 37mm shells.
It was extremely intense. Lost a lot of helicopters. You can tell it's there, and you can't out-climb it. You know, the loads we were carrying, we couldn't out-climb it, so we just had to evade it, come in low, come in fast, come in through the clouds. We were just coming into the A Shaw Valley. It was early in the morning, and they started firing at us, and we took around right through the tail rotor. Of course, the aircraft yaws tremendously when you lose tail rotor authority. The pilot was flying, and he did a great job of setting it down.
By 1969, the Army began focusing less on attriting the enemy and more on interdicting his supplies. VNVA and Viet Cong had long relied on a tactic of pre-stocking the battlefield. In areas where they planned an attack, they would first hide weapons, ammunition, and food.
The soldiers moved very lightly and quickly out, picked these things up, formed quickly, attacked, stashed their stuff, and melted away. And this was the vaunted mobility of the Viet Cong, was its ability to use prepositioned stocks and then disappear. They weren't carrying a lot of stuff.
The air cavalry opened and closed more than 50 fire bases near the enemy supply routes and continued the battle of interdiction for the rest of the war.
The mission there was to go out and root out the enemy's supply caches, get their ammunition and their food and their medical supplies, and cut the trail. And that's where the CAV really came into its own. Once you took the enemy's supplies away from him, and you interdicted all of his supply trails, didn't matter whether you kill him or not. He's out of business.
In January 1968, 6,000 Marines stood alone against an assault force of 20,000 NVA soldiers. For the first time, the cavalry would use all its combat forces in one rescue operation.
The relief of Khe Sanh was a classic air mobile operation. If there ever was a classic divisional air mobile operation, it was the relief of the Marines at Khe Sanh. In this one, we air assaulted brigades, one brigade here, and then the next day we air assaulted another brigade up here, and the next day we air assaulted the 3rd Brigade right at the entrance to Khe Sanh.
Although outnumbered, the cavalry rotated its fighting battalions in and out of combat zones. The enemy forces were knocked off balance and never recovered.
It was like a ballet, a very elegant maneuver of open a fire base, move troops in, then close it, move them, jump them somewhere else, and ultimately they just cleaned out the area around Khe Sanh. And the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry came into Khe Sanh, and they set up a sign saying, under new management, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, which didn't endear them to the Marine Corps.
The North Vietnamese left 1,300 dead and retreated to their sanctuary inside of Laos. Here they could regroup and plan their next attack.
For everybody who fought along the border, and this was any American unit that fought along that Cambodian or the Laotian border, that border and the sacrosanctness of that neutral territory was a thorn in the side, just plain festering wound.
On May 1st, 1970, President Nixon finally ordered U.S. forces to officially cross into Cambodia.
The first CAV, first into Cambodia, they located literally thousands of tons of supplies and equipment. Everything from food, rice, through medical supplies, ammunition, weapons. They found so many weapons in one place, they called it Rock Island East.
The Cambodian incursion was roundly condemned in the United States, but roundly applauded in Vietnam. The troops did not have any problem with that at all. President Nixon got very courageous, ordered the incursion, and then got very nervous and limited it in scope to 30 kilometers in depth and in time to 60 days.
The requirement to leave in 60 days placed a tremendous burden on them. The 60-day was an artificial thing that was laid on by the administration. And, if they had had another 30 days or another 60 days, they could have done a very complete job.
So the NVA should have sent him a telegram, thank you very much, Mr. President, because they just fell back behind that 30-kilometer thing and stayed out of harm's way while they reorganized. And then, knowing that they had a time limit, then they came back in and they made life very miserable for the CAV troops trying to withdraw out of there.
There was a relatively quiet period of time for about a year after that incursion in Cambodia. And if we had been allowed to stay there a bit longer, I'm sure that we could have cleaned out a great deal more out of that area.
Because of their mobility, the first CAV was in near constant contact with the enemy for the duration of America's longest war, and its soldiers saw more combat than most other units. Still, for all their bravery and sacrifice, a tour in Vietnam often brought more of a sense of emptiness than accomplishment. For many in the air CAV, the political restrictions were frustrating. For others, it was an ungrateful public.
I was in World War II when I came back. I came back on the maiden voyage of the Queen Mary after the war had ended. And it was a great sight. Sailing into New York Harbor with all at dusk with all the lights flashing on and off and the skyscrapers, the fire boats shooting their water up into the sky. And there wasn't any of that from Vietnam. Soldiers climbed on those airplanes leaving Vietnam with their first CAV patch displayed on their pocket. Proudly, and off were spit on. Called baby killers. After a year in the jungle fighting the North Vietnamese. Terrible. Sad period in our country's history.
While they weren't always welcomed home as heroes, the men of the 1st Cavalry Division can count on history to remember them and their sacrifice.
I like to think that we indoctrinated the Army. We showed them how good the helicopter can be when it's properly used. And to some extent, I think you can fairly say that the whole Army can now embrace what they call air-land warfare because of what we started with the Air Assault Division.
No matter how the war turned out, they fought it tooth and nail to the last day, the last unit in the field, and never gave up. They were not the first in, the Marines claim that, but they were the last out. The 7th Cavalry, the Gary Owen Task Force was the last American unit in the field in Vietnam. They were the best. Simply that, the best.
The 1st Cavalry Division was the first full division of the U.S. Army to arrive in Vietnam. And while it was customary for many units to leave after a year or two, the 1st Air Cav was one of the last to go after nearly 6 years of combat. During that time, their pilots and soldiers fought in all 4 of Vietnam's tactical fighting zones. But their legacy will forever be owed to the courage and tenacity of its most decorated men, those soldiers and pilots who took the fight to the Viet Cong and revolutionized air warfare under the threat of enemy fire.